Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the update with Oakwood Financial Group. I'm Joshua Dobi. Really appreciate you taking the time to sit with me here and to hear some words of update with regards to what's happening to us from an economic and financial standpoint. I'll tell you in advance, just so there are no surprises, I'm going to be relatively hyper-focused on the recent infrastructure bill, which just literally passed through the House of Representatives here this past Friday. And that was after this version had made its way through the Senate. So it's actually on its way to the president's desk. And we're anticipating that after a brief recess, which the House has this week, that there is going to be a signing ceremony, and the president is actually going to sign this into law. So we have a pretty high degree of expectation that this indeed will become law. And so we wanted to get, if you will, a little bit of a Cliff's Notes version out there to you. But before I do that, just want to talk a little bit about where things are market-wise. If you track some of the most popular indices, it has continued to be quite a positive year. If you look at the NASDAQ composite, you look at the S&P 500 index, if you look at the Dow Jones Industrial Average on the long end of things, you have seen a pretty positive year from an overall stock market standpoint. Now, there are other parts of the market which haven't done as well this year. If you're looking at U.S. Treasuries from a valuation standpoint, if you're looking at commodities, hard assets, i.e. gold, that have also had negative years to date. There are parts of the market that aren't doing well, and of course, as always, there are stocks which haven't done as well either. But when we look at the most, again, popular indices that are most often coming through our business news programs and through our newspapers, it has been, to date, another positive year. Now, we get a lot of questions. I'm sure you could understand, well, what's that going to mean for the balance of the year? I'm going to give you a terrible answer. I don't know. No way for any of us to know what's going to be like between here and there. But a couple of the things that we're watching closely, specifically, I'm giving a lot of attention to what the upcoming Christmas retail season will be. Now, it's not because the market moves in that much of a binary fashion, at least not over the long term, but the Christmas retail season in the short run tends to be an indication of consumer sentiment, and specifically consumer purchasing. And when we look at our GDP, recognizing or maybe perhaps being reminded that our GDP is roughly between 2/3 and 3/4 a function of consumer spending here in the US, it's a big deal. So we're watching the Christmas retail season, not because, again, it's a binary indicator in and of itself, but because it tends to be an indication about where the consumer is. And that obviously is a big factor in our economy. So we're going to be watching that. But again, very positive kinds of returns when you're looking at the indices that we track most often. You probably see most often inside, again, of your business news programs and newspapers. All right, let's shift gears a little bit. We're going to pivot into this infrastructure bill. There has been so much talk and so much rhetoric about what's in it, what's not in it, what's going to be included, the companionship bill with regards to what I will just broadly call social program spending. That still hasn't gone through yet. That's a second bill, also a multi-trillion-dollar bill that is making its way through Congress right now. That has not been addressed at this point. This is simply what's called the infrastructure bill. Now, there's a lot in here, and there's no way that I'm going to go through the hundreds of pages literally that comprise this bill. And no, I've not read every page yet. I'll raise my hand quickly. I have a Cliff's Notes version here that was actually compiled by one of the journalists at the Associated Press. And I found it, among the several different iterations that I read this past weekend, to be among the most concise and at least give you some bulleted points of understanding about what's included inside the bill. But there is a lot in it. I have a feeling I may do another video like this, if not for this bill, then certainly if the next bill passes, to be able to give some context to what exactly is included in there. So without further ado, let me dive right in, and please forgive me on this particular video. I am going to reference notes for this one because it is very fresh, very new to me, and so I don't have it all completely memorized yet. Don't mean to disappoint you, but I want to be able to reference it and give you good data, at least insofar as we have it at this point. Insofar as the estimates are concerned, and recognize that this next particular data point is an estimate with regards to the number of jobs which will be created over the next decade. The White House, so this is coming from the Oval Office, is estimating that up to 2 million jobs will be impacted in a positive way because of this bill. Now, Again, that's an estimate. It's obviously coming from the White House as well, so there is a political tint to it. You could say it's positive or it's negative. I'm not going to worry about the political aspects of it, but that is the estimate that's coming from the White House at this point because of the kinds of spending that will be done in this bill. So let's break it down into pieces. I'm going to look at these in terms of macro or large subject kinds of items. Because when we think of infrastructure, we think of certain things, and I do want to touch on those specific items in talking about, at least in large and round numbers, the kinds of things that are included in this bill. Let's start with roads and bridges, an easy one, and probably among the first that would come to mind when thinking about an infrastructure bill. This bill is going to provide $110 billion, $110 billion. So a very significant portion of the overall bill is going to be allocated towards our highway systems, bridge systems, road systems, rail systems that are going to be a part of that. Again, according to the White House, approximately 173,000 miles and 45,000 bridges are classified in poor condition. So that's been the reason why they're going to be allocating the funds or they're recommending that the funds be allocated that way, and that was the way that it's made its way through Congress. Public transit, so when we're thinking about buses that are run by municipalities and by departments of transportation, $39 billion, which would expand our systems, improve accessibility for people with disabilities, provide dollars to state and local governments to buy zero emission and low emission buses. So you're going to hear me say a couple of points here with regards to the infrastructure bill about ways in which, quote, clean energy is a part of the overall bill. And when we talk about clean energy, most often that means reducing the carbon footprint of the particular entities which are being used, most especially buses when it comes to public transportation, but also rail and airlines as well. So those kinds of things in there, but again, specifically $39 billion allocated for public transit and specifically for entities to buy zero emission and low emission buses. Let's talk about passenger and freight rail, most especially Amtrak. Amtrak is a quasi-government entity. I've had this conversation and even debate with a number of folks. Is Amtrak public? Is Amtrak private? I call it quasi-public. I'm not sure exactly what even that means, but it's a hybrid of some kind. And so there's going to be a significant amount of allocation from the federal government for Amtrak, specifically $66 billion. So again, a ton of dollars that are going to be poured into our passenger and freight rail systems to improve the rail service service to the Northeast Corridor, which is one of the most heavily trafficked of all of the corridors in the country, as well as other routes around the country. It's going to be the single largest investment in the history of Amtrak, so over 50 years. Electric vehicles, you've probably heard a lot. Certainly we've heard a lot here at Oakwood about EV, electric vehicles, battery-powered kinds of things. There's going to be a significant allocation inside of this bill for electric vehicle kinds of purchases and encouraging other entities to engage with electric vehicles, again, to reduce some of the carbon footprint with regards to emissions and wanting to reduce that. So the bill would spend $7.5 billion for electric vehicle charging stations. I've had that conversation with a number of you and a number of other folks as well. Say, well, it's one thing if we have electric vehicles, but where are we going to charge them except for our homes? It's a fair question. This bill actually is going to address that. $7.5 billion for electric vehicle charging stations around the country. Also provide another $5 billion for the purchase, again, looking at low emissions, reducing carbon footprint kinds of things. It would also provide $5 billion for the purchase of electric school buses and hybrids, or those which have internal combustion and battery operation, which again is reducing the reliance of school buses that run on diesel fuel. Internet access. If I could point to one part of this that certainly is new and unique in our generation when we're thinking about, quote, infrastructure, I would have to say it has to do with broadband or wide pipe internet access. Certainly 30, 40, 50 years ago, when we were thinking about infrastructure bills, that wasn't even a part of the discussion. It was George Jetson kind of stuff. I know I just dated myself there, but I do remember the Jetsons. That was George Jetson kind of stuff whenever that was first a part of the thought process. Now it is absolute reality, and actually the pandemic has enforced the idea about how vital it is, especially with school from home and work from home options exploding here over the last couple of years, about how important it is for our folks, especially for school where it's mandated that they have adequate broadband access. Now, if you live in a rural area, if you live in an urban area, suburban area, probably think, well, everybody has internet, don't they? No, they don't. Actually, substantial portions of the country have very little to no internet access or very weak broadband access. So this bill is going to allocate, again, big number here, $65 billion. So we're talking about a gargantuan sum of money. This legislation would allocate for broadband access, which would aim to improve internet services for rural areas, low-income families, and tribal communities. Again, attempting to expand the scope of access for folks, especially in spaces where it's mandated that folks stay at home. And it's not to say that folks are always going to be at home or school's always going to be at home, but the intention behind it, wanting to have that possibility where if we're in that space again, or especially in the work from home entity, if that option is available and you would like to work from home, and let's say you live in a more rural area instead of a more suburban or urban area, that you have the bandwidth, literally, to be able to do that. I mean, in this day and age, especially as you're watching this video right now, this video requires an extensive amount of bandwidth on your internet access to be able to view it. It's not done very simply. There's a lot going on here, especially with me moving my hands and bouncing around back and forth. But it's a very serious kind of thing, which again, this bill is intending to address so that there is more accessibility in places where right now that is a large difficulty. Modernizing the electric grid. Hard to think of something that would be considered more traditional in terms of infrastructure outside of roads, bridges, and rails than the electric grid. And as many of you know, especially those of you who have been a part of any kind of work with any of our utility companies, our electric grid here in the US is aged. That's probably the gentlest way that I can say it. We really have a lot of update needs. So this bill would protect against the power outages, which have become more frequent in our country, by spending, again, seems to be a common number here, $65 billion to improve the reliability and resiliency of the power grid. Now, what exactly does that mean? I'm frankly not intelligent enough to be able to tell you, outside of saying that there is going to be allocation inside of this bill to encourage shoring up our electrical grid so that in this day and age where the draw on it is more and greater than ever, that it has the resiliency to be able to hold up to that. Airports, hard to miss the importance of our airport system, especially here over the last couple of years during the pandemic when things were shutting down, and about the extreme impacts on our airports and on all of us in our ability to travel. So this bill would spend about $25 billion to improve runways, gates, taxiways at airports, and to improve the terminals themselves. It would also there will also be allocation for our air traffic control towers, which in many instances are 30, 40, 50 years old and older. So there's going to be a significant allocation there as well. Again, attempting to boost up or to bring up to code, if you will, some of the most vital parts of our infrastructure and transportation systems. Waste and water, white water, waste, and water. This legislation would spend about $55 billion on water and wastewater infrastructure, $15 billion to replace lead pipes, which is a serious issue, again, in some of our smaller and more rural communities where the water systems, again, may be 40, 50, 60, 70 years old. In some cases, and I know I've talked with you about some of you about some of this, upwards of 100 years old. It's amazing that it has lasted this long, but really needs to be updated. $10 billion also to address water contamination, again, from pipes that have had linings in them, which are beginning to decay, so a significant allocation for that. All right, so those are the big points when it comes to the infrastructure bill. Dear ones, there is a lot more than what I'm saying here. I just wanted to give you a very broad brush, very quick introduction to some of the major points that are being addressed, and certainly some of the larger dollar allocations which are noted inside of it. Several things that it's important to keep in mind. First of all, not all of this money is going to be spent right away. What we're talking about is a law that allows for the access or the accessibility of it. How long is it going to take? Depends on which parts of it you're considering. I'm not going to get into all of the different time frames there, but some of it could be years up to 10 years when this allocation may be spent. So important to keep that in mind. But the most important thing for the financial guy, I guess, in looking at all of this, is how we're going to pay for it. Frankly, at this point, that answer isn't very clean, at least not from the terms and the structures that I have seen inside of the system. Because for all of it, no matter how we move the dice around the table, for all of it, it's going to be some function of either debt or an increase in taxes. Period. That's the way that it's going to be. Now, some folks will say, well, we're taking money from other pots here and there, and that is exactly correct. I'm actually going to read a couple of them here in just a moment. Except, how do you think those initial pots got funded? Usually by debt or an increase in taxes. So it's very important to understand that that's how these things are funded in this day and age. I wish that the federal government was sitting on a big pile of either literal or figurative gold sitting out there, or at least dollars that was sitting out there to be able to fund such a thing. And the plain truth is that we don't have it. So how is this going to be paid for? Again, debt and an increase in taxes. But in terms of the particular veins from which it's going to be paid for, the 5-year spending package. So right now, there is just a framework for 5 years to be able to pay for this. The numbers I'm going to give you don't equal the 1.5 trillion. I'll tell you that in advance because there's a lot that's still gray as far as how this is going to be paid. But what we do know, what was indicated in this bill that made its way through the House, $210 billion in unspent COVID-19 relief aid, meaning that for all the number of programs that we had due to COVID-19, there was on the order of about $210 billion, which is going to be moved out of there and moved into this infrastructure bill. Now, when you say that, we say, well, those dollars are all set and ready to go. Sort of, except those dollars were a function of selling of U.S. treasuries, debt, to our country. That's why I framed it up in this way, because I don't want to give the unnatural impression that there are just these dollars sitting around all over the place that we're just plucking to be able to pay for these things. Yes, there may be allocations in other bills and other laws which have not been spent, and now they're going to be pulled here, but the origin or the genesis of those dollars, taxes and debt. So $210 billion COVID-19 relief aid, which wasn't spent, $53 billion in unemployment insurance that some states have halted. So there were allocations made at a federal level to be able to give unemployment insurance to the states. And of course, in literally historical numbers, that was done. But there was approximately $53 billion, which was allocated, which the states did not use. So that's going to be, again, repositioned out of one proverbial bucket, if you will, into this one for infrastructure. And then there is an array of smaller pots of money, like petroleum reserve sales, spectrum auctions for 5G services, etc. So again, I know those numbers don't add up anywhere near to a trillion or a trillion and above, but just to give you some indication about the legislative process, which sometimes includes taking money which hasn't been spent in some places, allocating it to spaces now where it may be spent. But it's important to understand the genesis of it, and understanding that, again, I wish the federal government had a big bank account, but they don't. And so we're going to need to be mindful of that, not only as we're making our way through the structure of this bill, but also I would offer up, maybe even more importantly, the next bill, which appears it's going to be making its way through Congress, this gargantuan social program spending bill, about how we're going to fund that also. So some real big questions that need to be answered, and the answers aren't easy, and they're obviously politically charged on both sides of the spectrum. So it's going to be important for us to weed out the emotional aspect of it and really attempt to understand what it is that's going to be part and parcel to our experience going forward. Because one of the things that's very true about our federal and state municipal governments, there only are a couple ways that things move. Generally speaking, money comes in from we the people, and then that money is allocated by the different government agencies to do all kinds of things. But it comes from we the people. So it's very, very important to keep that in mind, very, very important to pay attention. Certainly subsequent to this, if we get adjustments in our tax rates, all of those kinds of things, you'll hear from us. I'll be quick to provide an update for you to give my thoughts to it about where things are, the kinds of things to which you might need to pay attention, and certainly if it impacts you personally, good for us to chat about the kind of things we may need to do in order to perhaps tilt or change a little bit your overall financial plan. Well, friends, I'm a little bit out of breath. That was a sprint for me in terms of giving you a little bit of that update. I hope that was helpful for you. I know I ramrodded through it at a brisk pace, but I wanted to be able to give you just a brief synopsis on this bill as it's made its way now finally through both houses of Congress. Now it's going to the president's desk with every expectation it's going to be signed into law. you know, at any time. If you have questions about this, about other things that are happening with Congress, about your portfolio, if you'd like to tell me about your favorite Halloween costumes, I'd love to hear about that. I'm also interested in folks who maybe do things a little bit differently for Thanksgiving. I mean, turkey's wonderful. I love turkey, but I'm always interested in folks who are doing things differently as well and maybe partake of different traditions for the Thanksgiving holiday. Love to chat with you about that also. And if there is some hot gift for Christmas, I'm sure it's out there. I'm sure my young daughters will tell me about it at some point. I don't know what it is, but maybe get me up to speed on that as well. Always enjoy hearing from you. Friends, thank you so much for your time and patience and walking with me through this time of update. Always feel free to reach out to me at any time. I always enjoy hearing from you. And until the next time, I'll look forward to talking with you soon.